Okay, and welcome back. It's always a pleasure to spend time with these two gentlemen, one of whom is with us tonight, Clif. Hi. This is going to be a very interesting hour. The website is halfpasthuman.com, Adventures in Future Viewing. Let me read what they do in case you're not online right now. Here at Half Past Human, we forecast the future. We are not alone in forecasting the future. All humans do it to some degree. Just a quick search of the Internet, of course, will provide dozens of forms of future forecasting. Some use astrology, some use other methods. We employ a technique based on radical linguistics to reduce extracts from readings of dynamic postings on the Internet into an archetypical database. With this database of archetypical language, we calculate the rate of change of the language. The rate of change in the language being used on the Internet. The forecasts of the future are derived from these calculations. Our calculations are based on a system of associations between words and numeric values for emotional responses from these words. These emotional impact indicators are also our own devising, of our own devising. They are attached to a database of over 300,000 words. This database of linked words and phrases and emotions is our lexicon from which the future forecasting is derived. We call our future viewing the ALTA, A-L-T-A reports for asymmetric language trend analysis. The ALTA reports are available by subscription. I've been reading them for several months now, and they are truly fascinating. Welcome back, Clif.
Thank you very much.
Is it a cliffhanger?
In a sense, yeah.
From what I've been reading, it certainly is.
But reality is that way, isn't it?
Yes. These are not boring times we live in. Part 4 is just up, and I've been reading. I'm almost finished with Part 4 now. How long have you been doing this for our listeners who are new to you and George, your partner's work?
Well, I've actually been dinking around with the concept since 1994. Got active with SQL Server and most of the code base that allows me to do some of the linguistic joins in 1997. And I've been pretty much fortunate enough to be able to do it full-time since about 2004, I believe. So we've had reports out, essentially, our first one was 2001 when I happened to come across George Ure's site and saw a mind there that was not an idiot, to put it bluntly. And so shared my thinking with him, and he and I crafted a little thing that basically predicted the release of energy that later became the attack on, manifested as the attack on 9/11.
Now, when you say a release of energy, now that is a good way to sum up what they do. They look for changes, George and Clif, in the general terrain of language used. And there are several modes that come into this entire forecasting. There is, I'm going to use my own word, there is, I guess, anticipatory language, and then there's another, and then there is release language. Release language usually begins immediately after the event that is being forecast by the anticipatory language.
That's very concise. That's a very good way to put that, yes.
Thank you. If you ever need any help, let me know. No, I'm just enjoying this and trying to wrap my mind around it because it does reflect basically a new way to read the universal mind, the collective unconscious, if you will, which is quite able to exercise precognition and does. And,
all the time. And it's around us at thousands of levels, as I discovered in the 90s when I was just playing around with large masses of data. I came up from in the software business out of the phone companies, out of what are called OSPs or other service providers. And these are the little companies that sit all around the country and they eat up all the phone records and do the processing for the big boys and basically spit out the phone bills every month. So you get used to dealing with hundreds of millions of records. And it's a fascinating way to look at data. in huge, large masses. And I discovered things about language just in the process of living, I guess, that led me to think that there was more to it than we perhaps gave credence to. And that, for instance, your previous guest, I was tuning in and listening on your the free stream there, and you were discussing the UFOs and so forth, and you made a very prescient, it turns out, and very precise statement about how interesting it was that the UFOs that were sighted in the 50s looked older, that is to say, in our context, more antique than the current ones, less sleek, etc. Now let's cast our mind back, because you're honing in on an archetype. And we find out, for instance, that if we really look at UFO history, that's true across time, some astounding number of hundreds of years. In the 1800s, for instance, the UFOs of the day were called airships. And they transited around on the electrical lines that we were stringing all over the planet in the form of telegraph wires. And that was the nuclear plants of the day. And that's where they were centered mostly.
Energy, right? Yeah.
Correct, and electrical at that. But the context of the time was the UFOs presented themselves as airships, or we perceived them as airships, whichever way you want to look at that coin. There's two sides of it.
Right.
And if we're looking at it in the 50s, we see the ships at the time appeared mechanistic and something that, if you and I were to think of it, more big, thinned car look.
Right.
Okay.
57 Cadillac.
There you go, exactly. And these days, we've got a different archetype going that seems to be morphing. What with the drones that are now appearing? What if it's a situation of a pattern emerging, either that we are able to perceive the phenomena in a greater degree of technological recognition, and thus they appear to evolve over time, but the underlying phenomena is the same, or corollary is that they're presenting themselves in a form that they think we can understand. But in any event, none of that is material, but basically you've honed in on an archetype that we see all the time. And getting back to that in language, if we look at cultural groups like the British have a good archetype, and we look at slang a lot. Slang is really good because it's the bleeding edge, the very far edge of change in language, and so the appearance of new slang terms that take off and go ladder, which is a term that we use to refer to ladder diagram growth patterns, which are the same kind of patterns you might see in a virus in an orchard, for instance, or in any kind of a population.
Right.
But so if it goes viral, more or less, then we know that there's change coming. And,
Clif, can you give me an example of a slang term that has...
Sure. Let me give you a couple of them and how they vary across the...
Because slang comes and goes. It erupts quickly, and it spreads like a virus throughout the spoken consciousness of people who use slang terms, and then often it can fade away. Or
sometimes it can become more formalized.
Yes,
and,
indeed.
That itself is a unique sort of a thing. Like, look at the British with their term of brilliant. Anytime anything is really exceptional, they say brilliant. They've been doing so since 1920s with a consistency that is just truly amazing. Slang usually doesn't persist that long.
Right.
Now, is it because that indeed they're talking about, or their language emerges from a society that's rather dark, that there's, it's expressing an emotional archetype that, for instance, they label things as brilliant because the rest of their lives are not? We find this kind of a pattern emerging all over. If we look at the word cool in the United States, we talk about temperature a lot. Brilliant, for instance, refers to the underlying archetype of light. So you can take from that the light-dark duality, and here we have the temperature of the hot-cool duality within our culture.
Right.
And if we go and we look at the Soviets in the 50s, their slang at the time was translated into our language would be sharp or to the point. And is that because they were living in a dull society? So these archetypes are around us at all these different levels, and all we do is really compile archetypical relationships between words and then go see how they pop up. That's sort of our serendipitous approach. We can go hunting for things, but we just don't do that so much anymore because it's so much more fascinating to see what is delivered if we just turn on the taps and let the data flow.
Right. Now, you have written the software for this, and you use what they call spiders, and you send them out to do their little crawling and surveilling. How many do you send out?
It doesn't really work that way. It used to. A number of years ago, you used to be able to actually run your software on other people's servers. But of course, the Internet is a lot more hostile these days. So instead, really what our spiders do is sit on a server that's multitasking, 64-bit operating system, and each one of them gets a certain amount of program space, and then they just start eating Internet pages. We might run 30 or 40 spiders at any given point, reading maybe 19 or 20,000 pages a minute.
A minute?
Yeah.
Wow. How many times does a new word have to be used before it's flagged?
It depends on the context with which it's associated. So if we have a high emotional context like the nuclear, then we get that flagged the very first time it's used.
One time.
We come across it.
Wow. Okay. Hold on. Back in just a minute with Clif, and we're talking about halfpasthuman.com. One of the most fascinating things to subscribe to anywhere. Back right after this. Okay, back with Clif High of halfpasthuman.com. This Part 4 issue is fascinating. May I read just a little bit of one to give people an idea? This particular section is called Terra, Alternative Duality, Tempting Temples, Emotive Sheer Winds. What does that mean? Just for openers.
Well, the titles are reflective of the content found within the various entities.
Right, I understand that. The Terra is the general category here.
Is a container, if you will, that we use to represent those things, such as weather, climate, earthquakes, those things that relate to the human emotional condition relative to the planet. All this is seen from the human viewpoint.
Right.
So, for instance, we might say traumatic winds or dramatic rains, because in this case, what we're picking up is everything is emotional, and so we see that we pick up the precursors to some level of a dramatic weather event. So earlier in the year, George Ure was on radio talking, I believe, on like the 2nd of January, about the traumatic winds that we'd seen as basically a theme for the whole year.
Right.
And we were quite correct, and the number of tornadoes is exceptional, their ferocity is exceptional, the amount of damage